Welcome to Chautauqua People. My name is John V., and my guest today is Joan Brown Campbell, Director of the Department of Religion at Chautauqua Institution. Joan Brown Campbell currently serves as pastor to the congregation of Chautauqua Institution and as Director of the Department of Religion. She was ordained at age 50 after a life as a wife, mother, and community volunteer. She currently holds standing in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and the American Baptist Church. She has been active in the ecumenical interfaith movement both before and after ordination. She has served as Associate Executive Director of the Greater Cleveland Council of Churches, Executive Director of the U.S. Office of the World Council of Churches, and General Secretary of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the United States of America. While at the World Council, she developed extensive international connections. She was a key advocate in the return of Ilian Gonzales to Cuba in 2000 and has maintained cordial working relationships with clergy in Cuba, completing 39 trips to that island. She has maintained friendships with many Cubans, including Ilian, now age 20, with whom she most recently visited in May 2013. Archbishop Desmond Tutu has called Joan a woman of courage and compassion and observed that she was the only female in the procession of over 200 clergy for his installation as Archbishop of South Africa. He remarked that her voice helped bring an end to the evil of apartheid. Dr. Campbell's most recent book is titled Prayers from Chautauqua, published by the Pilgrim Press. Joan will be retiring from her position at Chautauqua Institution at the end of the current season. Joan, welcome to Chautauqua People.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
My pleasure. Joan, tell us how you came to be involved with the Cuban people.
The Cuban people have been known to the National Council of Churches for a very long time, almost 100 years. One of the things that people often don't think about is that the churches in Cuba and the churches in the United States had a very close relationship for a long period of time. So it was not at all unusual for someone who headed the National Council of Churches in the U.S. to have a relationship with the National Council in Cuba.
What key Cuban leaders have you met?
Well, I've met Fidel Castro. I suppose he is the most key person. And many of the people in the administration, the woman who heads all of the religious activities in Cuba. It might surprise people to know that that Cuba has, in fact, a person who is in charge of all the religious activity. And so many of the people who are in the headquarters, of course also Ilian Gonzales, as well as his family, his grandmothers and his great-grandmother.
How would you describe Fidel Castro's political inclinations?
Fidel Castro is most often thought about as a socialist more than as a communist. There's always a debate in Cuba about whether or not he really would be classed as a communist by other communists. The fact is they feel that his value system is basically that of socialism.
What are the key changes that you've observed during your many trips to Cuba and your involvement with the Cuban people?
One of the things that I've seen Cuba, because I've gone there for almost 39 years, and the thing that I've most noticed in Cuba is in the very beginning the churches had a very tough time in Cuba. Now it's very, very different. About 20 years into the revolution, the churches would then, it used to be that if you were a Christian you were not allowed to be part of the parliament in Cuba. Now anybody, regardless of their religion, can and is encouraged to be a part of the parliament. The churches now are taken very seriously. They're a key element in Cuban society. So that's something that I've noticed change. Cuba has gone through many changes over its time. Sometimes things were better for the Cuban people and some not as good. Right now Cuba is in a renaissance, I would say. They're beginning to open up. Cubans can now own restaurants. They now can display their wares. People who are painters, people who make all kinds of wonderful pieces of art, they are able to sell those now. And so Cuba is, though they wouldn't express it this way, they're moving much toward what we would think of in China, probably, where there is a combination of some of the capitalist issues along with some of the issues that have been traditional of Cuba.
Right. And I know I was in Cuba in May, and I was able to buy some art and barter over the price.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And maybe even the new thing now is you might have bartered with the artist.
I did.
That's
did.
very different. What it used to be was it all went through the government. Now it's much more entrepreneurial on the part of the people.
Right. Do you believe they have freedom of religion in Cuba today?
I think they do have freedom of religion. It might not be exactly the way we define it, because we have, of all the countries in the world that I've ever been to, we have the prize in terms of freedom of religion. I think people very rarely realize what it means to have the government out of religion as we do have it in the United States. But so in that sense, are they as free as our churches are? Probably not. But they certainly are free to worship. The Catholic Church, once again, has a cardinal. There was a whole period of time in which the Catholic Church, by their choice, not by Cuba's, did not have a cardinal. There's now a cardinal in Cuba. And no longer is the Catholic Church the main church in Cuba. The Protestant Church is now very prominent in Cuba and probably has equal standing with the Catholics.
Right, right. I know when you gave me the means to establish contact with the head of the Council of Churches there, when we talked, unsolicited comment, we now have freedom of religion. We've had it for at least 2 years. So that's I guess, wonderful things from our perspective, does it not?
Exactly, absolutely.
What will it take to improve relations, do you think, between the Cuban and the United States government? Actions on each.
Well, this is an issue that is, you have to talk about what will it take in Cuba, but also what will it take in the United States. And one of the people that I knew best, a man by the name of Alarcón, who would essentially have been, though they don't use that title, he was head of the parliament, he would have been almost like a vice president. He's now he's at an age where he has now stepped down, but he carried that post until last year. And he used to say, it's never quite the right time for Cuba in the United States. It's been 50 years that we've had the embargo against the Cuban people in the United States. And he said either there was going to be an election, there'd just been an election, someone had to always be careful of the politics. What would have to happen is that someone, particularly the president, would have to be able to say, we're going to have a difference in our policy toward Cuba. And simply, it has to be more than announced, obviously. But I do think it's doable, and right now there are some key senators who have been to Cuba, they've spent some time there, and if you ask them, Senator Leahy particular, he wouldn't mind being named, he is convinced that within a year or so there will be an arrangement between Cuba and the United States that will be quite different than what we have now.
I think that's very appropriate for my travel. Okay, and when is your next trip to Cuba?
I probably will go back in the fall. You know, it's now possible if you go with a religious license, which we certainly have at Chautauqua, because as director of the Department of Religion, we can now go without special permission from the United States government, and so it's much easier than it was quite a while ago.
Okay. Send me a note when you're getting ready to go.
Absolutely.
Maybe I'll join you. Okay, let's talk about the interfaith movement, which has clearly been a major part of your ministry through the years. And the United Church of Christ was formed in 1957 with a merger between the Christian Congregational Church and the Evangelical and Reformed Church. And in recent years, we've seen the Lutherans and the Episcopalians have decided that they too have come to the same place, but by some very different paths. I wonder if you could tell me and tell our viewers here just how that movement has affected things at Chautauqua.
Well, it has a very distinct effect on Chautauqua. I'd been here, I think, about 2 years when there was an announcement made that particularly the Episcopalians and the Lutherans, and this was key, agreed that they could share communion, that they would be able to receive communion in one another's churches. Those were the final 2 churches of the Protestant churches that had to agree to this. Once that happened, it was then possible to have a common communion service among Protestant churches. We're not there yet with Catholic churches, but among the Protestant churches. But a Lutheran and an Episcopalian still have to be at the table with whoever. If I'm the minister, I have to have a Lutheran and an Episcopalian on either side of me to make that into a perfectly legitimate communion service. So one of my visions was that we would have communion at Chautauqua. And as you well know, we may have 3,000 people in church, and really people puzzled over it. They said, you know, you can't be serious. You're going to have 3,000 people take communion, and it's not going to take an hour. This last year when we did it, we served 3,000 plus people communion in a beautiful service, and it took 9 minutes.
9 minutes.
9 minutes. We knew exactly how long it took.
Did you remind that to your critics?
Yeah, yes, I did. And at least I get to do that now. So
that's great.
It has become for many people, I would like to say, really a moment of unity in which they feel the unity. And they're inspired again, I think, to end the divisions that have so divided the churches.
Right, right. Do you see any other major events in the ecumenical movement, particularly in Africa?
Oh, yes, I think many things are happening in Africa that are very key. In South Africa, for instance, had it not have been for the ecumenical movement, I am convinced that South Africa would not have come to the freedom it came to without violence. And I think what was important was there are 300 councils of churches around the world, and the Council of Churches in South Africa and in many other countries and in the United States came together to try to work on the end of apartheid, and were very much partner with the churches in South Africa. And Desmond Tutu and a man by the name of Beyers Naudé, little known, but very famous in South Africa, they were the ones that helped to develop with de Klerk the final arrangement that made it possible for apartheid to come to an end without violence. My own feeling is it was as important as the bringing down of the Berlin Wall. Mm-hmm. Very few people ever thought that apartheid would end without violence, and it did.
And who would you attribute that great foresight to keep that country from going into a violent status?
I think it was, there's never a single person.
Right.
But I do think that the nature of Nelson Mandela himself, who, you know, when asked, I'll never forget when he came out of prison and someone said to him, how are you going to punish the people that kept you in jail for 30 years? And he just looked at this person and he said, if I do that, then I will be their prisoner for the rest of my life. He said, I do not intend to have vengeance against them. That attitude is what gave South Africa its freedom. Not just Nelson Mandela himself, but de Klerk, who was willing to stand down for the sake of the country. And part of what happened was the Council of Churches, the two people there, Desmond and Beyers Naudé, not a known name, they were partly the negotiating team that worked between.
They were.
Absolutely.
They were. I'm curious, was de Klerk a churchman?
Yes, he was. Yes, very much so, in the Church of South Africa, of course.
Church of South Africa.
Yeah.
Okay, and so we see good things for South Africa in the future, do we not?
Yes, I think they have a struggle. They have many of the same problems we did when the slaves were freed. They have people without adequate education, without enough jobs, but at least they have the possibility in a democratic society with a democratic convention and democratic processes to bring these things, even though they may be problems, to bring them to a table where they can be resolved nonviolently.
Right, right. So we remain optimistic, do we not?
I think it's very optimistic.
Right. Let's talk for Chautauqua in our time here. And tell me what brought you to Chautauqua.
Well, I actually came to Chautauqua as a child.
You did?
I did, indeed. My mother and father, I came here with my sister. We came for 9 years. And you know, what really was interesting to me was, and then for a lot of years, I didn't think about Chautauqua or come back to Chautauqua. My grandfather was a preacher here.
He really?
Yes, he preached there years and years and years ago. But I was invited back to preach. And when I walked into Chautauqua, I remembered it because I came with my grandmother and I thought it was just a great place as a kid. And I looked at this place and I thought, this is a gorgeous place and it has so much to offer. Why have I not remembered this place?
Right.
And at that point, I began bringing my family here, and my one grandchild, who's now 23 years old, she always loves to say, I came to Chautauqua before I was born, which in fact she did. And so I think that it became for us a family, just like so many people, a place for our family to come. And then I came back periodically and was a speaker and a preacher, and all that was fine. And finally someday Ross McKenzie, who was the director of the Department of Religion before I became the director, just casually over dinner said, would you ever think of taking this job of being director of the Department of Religion. I was just finishing my time as General Secretary at the National Council. I said, oh, I don't know, I haven't even thought about it. Well, I began to think about it, and we know what history tells us.
Right, and how long have you been in this job?
This is my 14th year.
14th year. Now, tell me what your responsibilities are as director, and a little bit about your experience as pastor.
Well, the director of the Department of Religion is responsible for choosing the preachers that come. We have usually a preacher for a week, so we will have 10 in a season. It's a very important choice to make because we have to balance denominations, racial equality, men and women, and of late, one of the great things that's happened is that we've had the whole struggle for the rights of gay and lesbian people has changed dramatically. And so we had a gay bishop for a preacher. That couldn't have happened 14 years ago.
That represents a major change, doesn't it?
It's a major change.
And how do you select these speakers for Chautauqua?
That is one of the most difficult tasks, particularly. We have about 59 speakers that we choose every season.
Right.
And in many ways, the preachers are not the most difficult to make the decisions about, but trying to choose the preachers for our interfaith lecture series, where we have a different person virtually every day, not always, but almost always.
Right.
So we're part of a group of people. I serve on the senior staff of Chautauqua.
Right.
So in that senior staff, we choose the themes around which the weeks are built. And it means that you have to find people that can speak to that theme. You can't just say, oh, I know Charlie and Betty and Fred, and they'd be good speakers. They have to be able to address the theme of the week. And so that makes it a tough job, but a very fascinating job.
Right. Now, are those presentations saved in some way?
They're all recorded.
They're recorded and
They're all recorded.
They're on video?
I shouldn't say all. Every now and then there's someone, for whatever reason, that doesn't choose to have their words recorded, but it's rare.
Right. And so most of those are available now on video, are they not?
They would all be available for people could order them.
And that becomes a significant one. Now, can you tell us about any other changes you've observed at Chautauqua in your time here?
Well, I think Chautauqua's striving for diversity has grown over the years. I think it's a very important urging that people have. Many people want Chautauqua to be more diverse, particularly, I think, in matters of race. And it's now public information that we're working with a number of black churches to try to develop the possibility of a Martin Luther King House for Justice on the grounds of Chautauqua. And we believe that would be sort of sign and symbol that this is an open and welcoming place.
Right, right. Generally, where has been the leadership for that effort at Chautauqua?
Well, the religion department really has given the leadership for this, but we're now joined. I mean, I think there's no question about what the president of Chautauqua, the chair of our board, all of these, and most of the board welcome this idea. They want to see Chautauqua become more diverse, and they know that it's important.
And I've been a participant in some of those discussions, and often it's more difficult, but indeed we keep the goal clearly marked and find what is the most advantageous route to get there, and I think we'll make it.
Well, and in the goals, as you well know, in the official goals of Chautauqua, which have to be passed by the board, this is not a couple of individuals that have this idea. The board themselves have within their plans for 10 years to come that we will work on the issues of diversity and also on interfaith diversity, which is very important. Now that we've moved beyond even just the Abrahamic of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, probably the best known religions among our people. But now we've encouraged some of our speakers to come who are Hindus and Buddhists, Baha'is, people who bring the Eastern religions as well. So hopefully we will look like the world as the days go by.
Right, right. Tell me for a few minutes about this publication, which I just bought today in the bookstore, by a very famous author, Chautauqua Prayers. I wonder what led to this.
Well, this book has, I think, a history that for me, has been a happy experience. When I came to Chautauqua and I realized that we had people of about 17 denominations who come to our services regularly, And I was quite well aware of the fact that to give them a prayer out of a prayer book that's Presbyterian or Lutheran or whatever you can think of would only fit a small number of the people. But it made me say, there's only one way to do this, and that the ecumenical way would be for me to write the prayers.
Right.
And so over the 14 years, I've written about over 500 prayers.
Right.
And many people have said, we wish we had access to these prayers. So the United Church of Christ said, we're willing to publish this. And if anyone's ever written a book, it's much more difficult than it seems to be.
Right.
But the fact is, there's now 200 prayers, and it's in print in this book of prayers.
I'll look forward to reading that. And your prayers are masterful, and we've
Thank you.
all said that down the road. Now, so we understand then the book is a significant one. Tell me what your plans are for retirement. What is high on your bucket list?
This is like such a hard question. I mean, part of what's on my bucket list is more time to spend. I have 8 grandchildren. I was privileged last year to do the wedding for my oldest grandchild, which is really a thrill. I mean, it's something that probably every mother and then grandmother wants to think that you might ever be able to do such a thing. And I want to be able to spend, they're grown-ups now, all of them. And except one, I have a 13-year-old, is to spend some more time with them. And because very often things have come up that I want to be present for. One of my grandchildren is going to start medical school on Monday.
Really?
And, she said, could I come to her white coat ceremony? Well, in the middle of Chautauqua, that's very tough.
Right.
So part of my goal in retirement is to be available for those kind of things. I probably would like to write another book. Okay. I've been privileged to know some of the world's great people, and my grandchildren often said to me, how did you know these people, Grandma? And I said, because I knew them when they were nobody.
Right.
And then that's how you get to know people.
Could you talk with your experience about one person who made a major role in your life, Martin Luther King?
Well, I was fortunate enough to work for Dr. King. And he changed my life, there's no doubt about it. And it wasn't always easy. Sometimes the change was painful. Way back in the early 1960s, it wasn't a very popular thing to work for Dr. King. People forget what a real struggle there was. But working with him over the years was really life-changing for me. I saw what my purpose in life was about, and he helped me to see that. He was there when he first came to Cleveland. He was there to help elect Carl Stokes, who became the first African-American mayor in a major American city. And so that also involved me in the world of politics. And I remember my then 10-year-old daughter, when we were walking the streets of Cleveland and people were saying terrible things about why would we want a black mayor in this city, and she said to me, why would anybody want to be mayor of this city when people treat you so badly? Fast forward, she became the first woman mayor of the city of Cleveland.
So
I think it probably would never have happened had I not have known Dr. King, had that not have helped me to work in the campaign for Carl Stokes, and for then Jane to know that who was mayor of Cleveland really mattered to the people of Cleveland, and then to run for Cleveland and serve as mayor was quite a remarkable thing.
Right. Now tell me about your other children.
I have 3 children. Obviously Jane, who was the mayor, she's now in the United States Senate, and she serves now as head of the Small Business Committee of the United States Senate, and she has been just recently Chief of Staff to Senator Landrieu from Louisiana. So obviously she's a politician. I have a son who's a doctor. My youngest son is a doctor. He does geriatric medicine, which I'm very happy about at my advanced age, that I have a hometown in my home person who knows geriatric medicine. But more than that, he also does family practice, and he really believes that's what we have to have, are more family practice doctors. And my older son works for International Baccalaureate. He works on education, and he helps to run the United States office of the International Baccalaureate, and he was a kid that wasn't too crazy about school.
Oh my goodness.
So there he is, an educator.
And so he's right in with it now. You're very proud of them, are you not?
I'm extremely proud of them, and they were wonderful parents. And they've given me, one of life's great gifts, grandchildren.
Great, great. I've got one last question for you, Joan. How long will you continue to come to Chautauqua?
Forever.
Forever.
Forever. Once I found out about Chautauqua, and now just think I can come back and I can play. And I can do what I want to do. I don't even have to go to church every Sunday
Oh, my
unless
goodness.
it's something I choose to do.
Okay.
And I probably will choose to do
We'll
it.
choose.
But I do want to say that the person who's coming to take the position has been a friend of mine for 30 years, Robert Franklin, an African-American, our first African-American staff person at the senior level in Chautauqua. So for me, I feel like Dr. King is looking down and saying, good work, Joan.
Good work.
Good work. So I'm very proud of that.
Great. Joan, thank you very much for being on Chautauqua People.
Thank you.